Okay, this is lesson, I guess, 6. Yeah. The Scholastic Intensive. So let me just explain what just happened. So the last few lessons, we've gone through a verbal system. It is what we went through when we did the present tense, the perfect tense, and the imperfect tense, and the imperative and the infinitive, right there. Those all made up a state of the verb. That was one kind of verbal system, the most basic one. So the basic verbs are all going to fit these patterns. There are two other states of the verb. So two other sort of full patterns that are very similar to the ones that we just learned. And they have a kind of a slightly different meaning. So let me just show you how similar a lot of these are going to be. This is the present tense of the intensive. It's going to be using the same endings. You're going to look at the passive, going to be very similar. There's the perfect, it's going to look almost the same. The perfect passive, it's going to look almost like the one you already know. So don't panic when you see it for the rest of the book. There's so much more stuff to memorize. There's actually very, very little left to memorize. If you've memorized all the patterns that I've asked you to memorize until now, you basically know the language, but there's just going to be some adjustments to make and then practice. So what I'm going to do for the next 2 lessons, before we get to Robinson, is work through this lesson, the intensive. I'm going to do all the conjugations. So everything that I did the last 3 lessons, I'm going to do all right now with this intensive state. And then next class, it'll be the causative. I'll explain what that is. You already know what it is from Chaldean. And I'm just going to work through the whole thing. And you'll see that you already know mostly what's going on with these verbs. So this entire schema that we just went through is repeated in the scholastic intensive state, often called the pa'al by grammar books. That's what we're going to be calling it in the next book. The main sign of the intensive in the scholastic dialect is a pthaha vowel on the first radical in many conjugations, as well as the meme in the present tense. Full charts are given below. The verb to kill is used in all charts because of its regularity. Okay. So what does it mean? What does the intensive mean? It's going to be the same root. So look at this root. Tal, you already know this means to kill. What's the difference between qatalna and muqattalna? Qatalna means I kill. Muqattalna means I murder or I am murdering. So it's just like the name indicates, it's an intensified version of that same verb many times. Other times, you just kind of have to look it up. And why is it in this form rather than another? Sometimes the dictionary will show you that it has kind of a specialized meaning. So it is worth looking up the root if you're not really familiar with it. So don't always assume that it just means an intensive. But in this case, it does. So let's look at the conjugation. So muqattalna, muqatlana. So what's the same as what you already know? The na is the same. The copulas are all going to be exactly what you already know. What has changed? Just this. The pthaha, so this vowel, the a vowel on the first radical. Muqattal. Muqattal. It sort of sounds intensive. So qatalna becomes muqattalna. Qatlana becomes muqatlana. And so on. So let me just read through the conjugation. مقتلنا مقتلانا مقتلات مقتلاءات مقتل مقتلة مقتلينا, again same endings, same copulas. مقتلانا مقتلينتون مقتلانتين مقتلين مقتلان. Very, very, very similar to the conjugation all the way up here that you learned right here. Awidna, and so on. Okay. So just the new thing is just knowing that there's this meme and then the qa. The qa is what makes it intensive. Muqattal, muqattal. Okay. That's it. Memorize it. Not much new to learn. The passive, now there's a little bit of a difference. Instead of the qil with the yod in the middle, the vowel just kind of shifts. So مقتلنا is I am murdered. So مقتلنا is I am murdering. مقتلنا is I am murdered. It's a very, very subtle difference. Do your best to memorize it. Now, Robinson is going to give us some practice with it. However, the feminine is exactly the same. So مقتلانة and مقتلانة, I am murdering and I am murdered, feminine, are exactly the same word. It's weird. I don't know what to tell you. Context will hopefully tell you which one it is. So let me just read this conjugation. I am murdered, مقتلنا, مقتلانة. You are murdered, مقتلات, مقتلاات. He is murdered, مقتل. She is murdered, مقتلة. مقتلينا. Now the rest are going to be exactly the same. So again, it's just going to be context that's going to tell you what it actually means. مقتلينا, قتلانا, قتليتون, قتلان, تين, قتلين, قتلان. The intensive perfect is nearly identical to the ordinary perfect form. So you already memorized the perfect form last chapter or last lesson, or 2 lessons ago, whenever, except for the diagnostic vowel, the vowel that tells you that it's this conjugation. So here, instead of قتليث, it's قتليث. Everything else is the same. So the becomes a. قتليث. Instead of قتلت, it's قتلت. قتلت. قتلتي. Or just قتلت. قتل. قتلث. So if you remember, it was قتلث. Now the intensive is قتلث. She murdered. قتلن. قتلتون. قتلتين. قتل. قتل. Again, this is a silent. So again, it's exactly what you already know, just the pthaha vowel on the first radical. That's why I feel okay going fairly fast through these, because you basically already know the endings. Perfect passive, again, ith is at the beginning, so you already know it. Ith qat leith. Instead of ith. Actually, this is exactly the same, this particular word. I was murdered, ith qat leith. Ith qattalt, so instead of ith qtalt, it's ith qattalt. You were murdered. Ith qattalt, with the yod at the end. Ith qattal. Ith qatlath, she was murdered. Ith qattaln, we were murdered. Ith qattalton. Ith qattaltin. Ith qattal. Ith qattal. You already know this, just vowels have moved. And those vowels moving in those few cases just very slightly change the meaning to something more intensive. The imperfect uses the same prefix consonants in its conjugation, except with the typical pthaha vowel of the intensive. So it's all the same. So it's an alep at the beginning. I will murder. Qattil. You will murder is tqattil. You feminine, tqatlin. So it's all the same beginnings that you already have memorized. He will murder, nqattil. She will murder, tqattil. We, nqattil. Tqatlun, tqatlan. Nqatlun, nqatlan. The pattern is exactly the same, just some vowel differences. The passive of the intensive imperfect, also, it's exactly what you would guess. It's the same ith. So I will be murdered. Ith qattal. You will be murdered. Tith qattal. Tith qatlin. Nith qattal. Tith qattal. Nith qattal. Tith qatlun. Tith qatlan. Nith qatlun. Nith qatlan. Just what you'd expect. And again, we are going to go through all of this over again, but do your best to memorize all this stuff now, so that when we get to the exercises, it'll be really easy for you. The imperative, exactly as you'd guess, qattal. And they all are pronounced that way. Ith qattal for the passive imperative, all pronounced that way. Then the infinitive, to murder, this should be to murder. Mqattalu. Mqattalu, and then mithqattalu, to be killed. It sounded like a lot, but it's all stuff you already know. It's just giving you the state that makes, generally speaking, an intensive meaning. So learn it. Next class, we're going to do the causative and then some object endings, and then we're done with this book and we're going to move on to the next book.